Hi, welcome back. Today we're talking about something that sounds almost too strange to be true, but it's happening right now in 2026, and it's already shaping the price of silver in your pocket, your portfolio, and maybe even your retirement account. China has quietly moved to restrict silver and a chemical called sulfuric acid from leaving its borders, and the United States has responded by declaring silver a matter of national security. Two of the biggest economies on the planet are suddenly treating a metal most people associate with jewelry and old coins as if it were oil, uranium, or rare earth elements. So let's break this down and figure out what's actually going on, why it matters, and what it could mean for the years ahead. Let's start with the basic picture, because silver has been quietly running a deficit for years, and most people have no idea. Every year since roughly 2021, the world has used more silver than miners and recyclers have been able to produce, not by a small margin either. Industrial demand, solar panels, electric vehicles, semiconductors, medical devices, and electronics have all been pulling silver out of the ground faster than the ground can give it back. By early 2026, that shortfall had piled up to more than 800 million ounces over 5 straight years, which is roughly equal to an entire year of global mine production being erased. And 2026 is now shaping up to be the 6th consecutive year of deficit. Think about it this way. Imagine a bathtub where the drain has been open wider than the faucet for 6 years straight. At some point, you're not just low on water, you're scraping the bottom of the tub. That's essentially where the global silver market stands right now. Now here's where things get interesting. Because into this already tight market, China made a series of moves that most people outside the mining industry never even noticed. It started quietly in January 2026 when Chinese authorities introduced new export licensing rules on silver. This meant that instead of silver flowing freely out of the country, companies now needed government permission to ship it abroad. This matters enormously because China controls somewhere between 60 and 70% of the world's refined silver supply. When the country that refines most of the world's silver decides to slow the tap, the rest of the world feels it almost immediately. Then in March, China's own silver imports hit record levels, essentially the country pulling in as much silver as it could get its hands on, even as it was making it harder for silver to leave. But the move that really caught traders and analysts off guard came in the spring, when China announced it would halt exports of something you've probably never thought about before, sulfuric acid. Now, on the surface, sulfuric acid has nothing to do with silver. It's an industrial chemical used mostly to make fertilizer. But here's the catch, and this is the part that connects everything together. Roughly 70% of all newly mined silver in the world isn't mined on its own. It comes out of the ground as a byproduct of mining copper, lead, and zinc. And one of the key steps in extracting copper from ore, especially through a process called heap leaching, requires pouring sulfuric acid over crushed rock to dissolve the metal out. No acid, or less acid, or more expensive acid, means copper mines slow down, and when copper mines slow down, the silver that rides along with that copper slows down too. So why would China ban an acid to control a metal it never even mentioned? Part of the answer traces back to the conflict in the Middle East. The closure of shipping routes through the Strait of Hormuz cut off a large share of the world's sulfur supply, which is the raw material used to make sulfuric acid in the first place. China, trying to protect its own farmers and its own fertilizer production during a critical planting season, moved to keep more of that acid at home. On paper, this was a domestic decision about food security, not a silver strategy. But intentional or not, the ripple effect landed squarely on the global copper and silver supply chain. Chile, the world's largest copper producer, imports well over 1 million tons of Chinese sulfuric acid every single year. When that flow tightens, mining costs in Chile rise, and some marginal production becomes uneconomical to run. The same pressure is showing up in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia, both major copper producers that also depend on imported acid. Now this is important because it shows you something about how modern resource politics actually works. Nobody had to say the words "we are targeting silver" for silver to be affected. By controlling a completely different chemical, tied to a completely different industry, China ended up squeezing one more link out of an already stretched silver supply chain. It's a bit like discovering that a bridge closure 3 towns over is the real reason your commute is suddenly 20 minutes longer. The connection isn't obvious until you actually trace the road. While all of this was unfolding on China's side, something equally significant was happening in Washington. In November 2025, the United States Geological Survey added silver to its official list of critical minerals for the very first time in the list's history. This list isn't just a symbolic label. It's the document that guides where the federal government focuses investment, which mining projects get streamlined permitting, and which materials are considered essential enough to justify direct government support. Silver joining that list, alongside minerals like copper and uranium, was a clear signal that Washington now views silver less like a shiny collectible and more like a strategic resource the country cannot afford to be cut off from. Then in January 2026, the administration went a step further. A presidential proclamation implemented findings from what's known as a Section 232 investigation, the same legal process historically used to justify tariffs and trade protections on things like steel and aluminum. The government's own findings concluded that the United States imports roughly 2/3 of the silver it consumes, and doesn't have nearly enough domestic refining and processing capacity to close that gap through mining alone. In other words, America uses a lot of silver for defense electronics, for solar infrastructure, for medical technology, but doesn't produce or refine nearly enough of it at home. That kind of dependency, especially on a supply chain running through a geopolitical rival, is exactly the sort of vulnerability that national security planners lose sleep over. Here's what this means in practical terms. Once a material is treated this way, the government gains tools it didn't really use before. It can direct funding toward domestic mining and refining projects. It can prioritize supply toward defense and energy sectors ahead of general commercial buyers. It can even begin building a stockpile, something the United States actually used to have decades ago, when silver was part of the old national defense stockpile going back to World War II, before those reserves were fully sold off by the year 2000. Now, more than 2 decades later, the conversation about the government holding strategic silver again is back on the table. So picture the situation as it stands. On one side, China is tightening the export spigot on both silver itself and the ingredients needed to produce it as a byproduct of copper mining. On the other side, the United States is building the legal and policy framework to secure its own supply, potentially even competing more aggressively for it on the world market. Neither country needed to declare an open conflict over silver for the effect to be the same. Two of the largest economic powers in the world are now quietly pulling supply in different directions. At the exact moment, global inventories are already thinner than they've been in years. Now let's talk about why this actually matters to someone watching this video. Someone who isn't a mining executive or a commodities trader, just a regular person trying to understand what's happening with their money. Silver isn't only a precious metal you might hold as an investment. It's woven into products you use and rely on every day. Solar panels need it. Electric vehicles need it. Your phone, your laptop, and hospital medical equipment all contain small amounts of it. When the raw material behind all of that technology becomes harder to source and more expensive to source, that cost doesn't just disappear. It tends to work its way through supply chains, into manufacturing costs, and eventually into the prices consumers pay. For investors specifically, tightening supply combined with steady or rising demand is the classic recipe that tends to support higher prices over time, though of course nothing in markets is ever guaranteed, and short-term price swings can go in either direction based on countless factors that have nothing to do with the long-term supply story. It's worth pausing here to say clearly that nothing in this video is a suggestion to buy or sell anything. This is about understanding the forces at play, not about telling you what to do with your own money. That decision belongs entirely to you, ideally made with your own research and, if needed, a conversation with a licensed financial professional who understands your personal situation. If you're finding this breakdown useful, it genuinely helps the channel when you hit subscribe so future videos like this one land in your feed without you having to go searching for them. No pressure either way, just something to consider if you want to keep following stories like this as they develop. Now, to be fair and balanced about this, it's worth acknowledging the other side of the story. Not everyone agrees that this supply squeeze will be as severe or as lasting as some headlines suggest. Some analysts point out that mining companies are adaptive. If sulfuric acid becomes scarce or expensive in one region, buyers can and do search for alternative suppliers, even if that takes time and raises costs in the short run. Higher silver prices themselves can also pull more supply into the market over time, as previously uneconomical deposits suddenly become worth developing, and as recycling of above-ground silver from old electronics and industrial scrap becomes more attractive. There's also a chance that diplomatic developments, whether in the Middle East or in U.S.-China trade relations, could ease some of these pressures faster than markets currently expect. Markets tend to price in worst-case scenarios quickly and then adjust as reality turns out to be messier and slower moving than the initial headlines implied. Here's a simple mental framework that might help you make sense of this going forward. And really any resource story like it. Ask yourself 3 questions whenever you hear about a new mineral restriction or trade policy. First, how much of global supply does this actually affect? Is it a small percentage or a dominant one? Second, how easily can buyers or producers substitute their way around the restriction, find new suppliers, or adjust their processes? And third, how long is the restriction likely to last? Is it a temporary reaction to a specific crisis, or does it reflect a deeper structural shift in how a country views its resources? Applying that framework here, silver checks a lot of boxes that suggest this is a meaningful story, rather than a passing headline. China's dominance in refining is substantial. Substitution takes real time in mining, and both countries appear to be building longer-term policy structures rather than reacting to a single news cycle. Looking ahead, there are a few reasonable paths this could take. One possibility is that the acid restrictions prove temporary, tied specifically to the disruption in Middle Eastern sulfur supply, and ease once shipping routes stabilize and alternative sulfur sources come online. Another possibility is that China's export licensing on silver itself becomes a more permanent feature of how it manages a resource it increasingly wants for its own solar and electric vehicle industries, which are massive and still growing. On the American side, critical mineral status for silver could translate into real investment in domestic mining and refining over the coming years. Though building new mining capacity realistically takes years, not months, so any meaningful boost to domestic production is a longer-term project rather than a quick fix. In the meantime, the existing deficit doesn't just vanish. It has to be filled from somewhere, typically from above-ground stockpiles that have themselves been shrinking for years. Stepping back, what we're really watching is silver's identity shifting in real time. For a long time, it sat somewhat in gold's shadow, seen mostly as a monetary metal or a smaller, cheaper alternative for investors. But its role in modern industry, in solar energy, electric vehicles, and advanced electronics has quietly made it something closer to a strategic input that entire economies depend on. When two major powers start treating a metal like that, restricting its flow on one side and building policy protections around it on the other, it tends to signal that both sides believe the resource matters more than the general public currently appreciates. So here's the bottom line to take away from all of this. Silver has been running a supply deficit for 6 years running, and now 2 of the largest economies in the world are actively shaping how that limited supply gets allocated. China, by tightening exports of silver and the industrial chemicals tied to its production, and the United States by formally recognizing silver as essential to its own economic and national security. None of this guarantees any particular price outcome, and markets rarely move in a straight line. But it does tell you that the story around silver has moved well beyond simple supply and demand charts and into the realm of global strategy. Whatever happens next, it's a development worth keeping an eye on, because the decisions being made in trade offices and policy meetings right now are quietly shaping a market that touches far more of daily life than most people realize. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.